Today we will be in Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 and 9. In the prior verses, we've seen in this post-flood situation how God has dealt with the sanctity of life, reissued in a certain sense the dominion mandate, provided food for Noah and his family. Now he's going to enter into covenant with Noah, and really one of the highlights of this whole sequence of chapters. Let's begin. Kai epen ha theos to Noe, kai tois huiois autu met autu legon. Ego idu anistemitain diatheken mu humin. Kaito spermati humon meth humas. The kai here, of course, just linking back to the preceding verses, just going to show a continuation of the narrative. Verb here begins with apen, and that, of course, is the third singular aorist active indicative from lego. So someone said, and it's, of course, God, and he's speaking, at least in this initial pass, to Noah. So, and God said to Noah, but also and to his sons. Notice these Noah's sons here, who are met autu, that is, they are with him, that is coming out of the ark and so forth. We've seen this varying focus on Shem, Ham, and Japheth throughout. Then legon, another use of lego here, only this time it's the nominative singular masculine present active participle, taking God here implicitly as the subject of that participle. And so, and God said to Noah, or spoke to Noah and his sons with him, saying, Ego, idu, so I, behold. So it's a nice, almost an emphatic way of introducing this speech act. You see it's a nice reflection of the Hebrew there. And then our verb here is anistemi. And we're going to talk about that in more length here in a moment. And so that means something like to raise up. The Hebrew here is kum. And it's kind of an interesting use of that verb here in this kind of context. This is just the first singular present active, just the normal form of that. So, behold, I will, or am raising up, something like that. Tain diatheken. So this is going to be our covenant word. And throughout the Greek scriptures, translating berit typically in Hebrew, you will see diatheke, and that is the word, of course, that is used in the New Testament as well, as opposed to the word that was fairly common in secular context, suntheke. And down the road, we'll see that. Sometimes that'll show up with the hexapla and so forth. And it's my covenant. So behold, I raise up my covenant to you, referring to Noah and his sons, but then it's also and to the offspring, namely your offspring, methumas. And notice we had a met autu here, but that's with the genitive, so that's with in that particular context. Here, though, it's accusative, and so that's going to be after. That is the offspring, the sperma that come after your present generation. So this covenant is going to be with Noah, his sons, and then their offspring after them. We'll see in the next video that it actually gets broadened to creation as well. But it's important to remember that initially this covenant is God's covenant, and it is with Noah and his line. I also point out that this use of sperma here, if you know your theology, it goes back simultaneously to Genesis 3, but it also points forward to Genesis 15 and following. So it goes back to Adam with the sperma promise. It also points forward to Abraham and his sperma promise as well. But we'll get to that down the road. Now, let's kind of double click on this use of anistemi here and why it's kind of interesting. Here, I've put on the screen a summary of the major covenant inauguration scenes within the essentially the Greek Pentateuch and thereafter. And what's interesting is that typically when you get to Abraham in Genesis 15, you actually are going to see diatithemi as opposed to anistemi. And you may recognize that actually is a sort of verbal form of diatheke. So I will make a covenant, if you will, is what you'll typically see. The Hebrew is karat, which is to cut a covenant. That's a pretty common way in which those sorts of things are phrased in the ancient Near East. You see the same thing with Moses in Exodus 24. The climax of the Sinai event is diatithemi plus karat. Same thing with David. Even though in 2 Samuel 7, which is the main chapter with respect to that, you don't see that language, it is reflected in Psalm 89 or 88 in the Septuagint. Same thing, diatithemi plus karat in the Hebrew. And the New Covenant, chiefly reflected in Jeremiah 31, which is, by the way, 38 in the Septuagint, you have diatithemi and karat. But instead here with Noah, you have anistemi or kum. And so that has generated a lot of interesting conversation as to whether we should see this raising up as pointing back to an implied prior covenant, perhaps with Adam, A lot of covenant theologians will kind of make that connection that instead of karating, if you will, or diatithemi, this change in verbiage, or this use, and it really only shows up here with Noah, could imply that he is raising up an existing covenant. Of course, back in Genesis 2 and 3, the covenant language isn't directly used. That, of course, doesn't necessarily mean it's not there in principle. You don't have to have the vocab for the theological structure to be there. So anyway, kind of interesting little vocab study there with the use of these covenant words. It's diatheke throughout all of these scenes. But you do have the difference in the verbal form, both in the Greek and the Hebrew. So just food for thought. I find that to be kind of interesting, and there has been some scholarly discussion on that. Well, that's it for now. In the next video, we'll see how the scope of the covenant gets expanded in the next verse. But thanks for watching along here.